hardest thing to do is to practice what you preach. So all these years, as Bill Clark mentioned, me telling people how to give speeches like this, I now find myself in the same position of trying to keep things succinct. Of course, I've already violated the first rule. Don't discuss the rules. And now I'll violate Rule 2, avoid thank yous. But I can't stand up here tonight and not thank the Trinitarians and the school for allowing me to work here all these years, but also for throwing this event tonight. I was hired by 3 people, actually, John Moylan, Jim Zwolak, and Father James. I knew Father James best of all, and he and I went out to Lido's one night to discuss the job. Ironic, 2 years later, he was the one who left. However, he is back now. And I'm sure I could not ever say enough about John Moylan in terms of his passion in running the school. When it was announced he was stepping down as principal, I was quoted in the paper as saying that you didn't have to love John Moylan, but even his detractors would never question his work ethic. And I meant that as a compliment. Actually, I have one little story about John, and they made some video about John. We were given a cute name. We were going to call it 60 Minutes. But after John got finished speaking, we renamed it 48 Hours. I know that, I think I see moved this here. I have to say this. In 1993, Maury Wooten won his 1,000th game. And I was watching the game in the stands with Bill Day of the Washington Post. The next day, front page of the Washington Post, right below the fold, I was quoted as a good personal friend of Morgan Wooten in the newspaper. I was fine with that. I called up Morgan that afternoon and said, "Are we going bowling tonight?" It turns out that night we played High Point over the Tacoma Academy and we lost. And I went to Lido's after the game and I went up to Morgan and said, "The friendship is history." Anyway, looking around this room, there are so many people that I would like to thank, but time will not allow me to do so. And now I may have had some disagreements with some people along the way, as we all do, regardless. Again, I could go along at every table here, and I can't thank everyone enough for working with me down through the years. And you'll have no idea of how you have touched my life, and that I've had the sincere pleasure of working with you all. As I often say, I cannot thank you all enough. There are a few others I must also acknowledge. Dan McMahon, who is equally as passionate about DeMatha as John Moylan. And were it not for Dan, and some things that Dan did for me a few years ago, I am confident I would have left several years ago. I must also acknowledge the people who have directly worked with me, Barb Coyle, Gavin Buckley, and yes, my boss, Maureen Looney. Maureen could not be here tonight, and I have a brief story about her in just a bit. I must also congratulate the fellow honorees tonight, and thank my presenter, Bill Clark. We'll talk later, Bill. Thank you. He actually stole a little bit of my thunder because when I first came here, we worked in this old house that was covered completely in bamboo. And Bill was working on the yearbook. And while I knew a lot of people here at DeMatha at the time, Bill truly made me feel welcome. And he's been a great sounding board for me down through the years. When we dedicated the library for Dr. McMahon last October, Dan said that when you work for a Catholic school, your family works for you as well. And tonight I do have my 3 sisters with me who've heard about DeMatha ad nauseum since 1988. And I also have my Uncle Joe with me who attended DeMatha in the early 50s and received an official diploma in 2008. We won't go further into that. Of course, though, most of the brunt of my DeMatha experience has fallen on my son and daughters, and namely my wife. Particularly when my son went here, there was not a night that did not go by where we did not talk about DeMatha. And my wife, who has threatened me if I bring her up, oh well, she is the reason why I am still here. She has believed in me, and yes, DeMatha, down through the years. I think all of my family has worked at some point for the school, and I can still picture my wife, pregnant, working in an empty office building on a Sunday just before Christmas on DeMatha's athletic magazine. Yes, we got paid for it, but at the end of the day, she did it for me. Well, not to go over long past history, and Bill certainly went over some of my foibles, but some of my experiences here as a student were not all that positive. As he said, I was cut from virtually every team, and I was even denied entrance to the National Honor Society. Father James was a moderator. But yet, a number of faculty members looked out for me: Joe Carroll, Father James, and Buck. Father James helped me to get a part-time job that helped me pay for college, and when, as Bill referenced, I almost lost my life working at that job in an attempted robbery, he was the first one to call me the next day to see how I was doing. DeMatha prepared me well for college, helped me get a scholarship, and the friends I have today are the friends I made at DeMatha. In fact, I now scoff when alums cite one bad day or one bad experience when they say they will not give to the school. High school is supposed to be challenging, and those things that hurt also instruct. No one grows through high school unscathed. So why have I stayed so long? I want to bring up just a few memorable experiences down through the years. I remember vividly the assembly we had in the gym after we won the football championship in 1993. If you recall, Tim Strachan was left paralyzed that summer in a terrible accident, and his first day back on campus was at that assembly. Bill McGregor and the TV reporter Pat Collins said afterwards it was like a scene from a movie. I had many experiences with Bill back in those days, and I'm sorry those days ended. I will never forget in 1996 when Morgan Wooten needed a liver transplant to save his life, and when the operation was indeed had, his wife Kathy, who was here tonight, in a press conference back then, the first words out of her mouth were to thank the family of the donor. It seems like so many of my experiences here have been tied to tragedy or death, and the many people we have lost along the way. Brandon McCarthy, Ray Smith, Art Doyle, Tony Villela, Ricky Gray, Brian Gray, Coley Mellett, Tom Eastman, Barb Breyer, Mike Busink, Rico Webb, Brendan Looney, of course, and many, many more. But through all of that sadness comes our faith. Therein lies the reason why I'm here. Hold that thought now just a second, because I want to tell this story. One of the most memorable experiences that I had on this campus was sadly after Brendan Looney died, and we had the wake in the Convocation Center, and there must have been 3,000 people in the Convocation Center. And afterwards there was a reception here in the Ample Room. And during that time, I know Maureen Looney well enough that I gave her her space. But that night, and I have to go back just a little bit, when she first got hired, Brendan Looney was an office assistant for me right outside of my door. A long line of great office assistants like Tommy Palucci and Justin Fairfax. And I really thought a lot of Brendan. And when Maureen first started, I used to bring up Brendan all the time. Like, Brendan Looney's salt of the earth, great guy. And I continually said that. And finally, one day she said to me, she goes, you know, I have other children. I mean, I'm glad you like Brendan, but for crying out loud. But we'll go back to that night. I did not really talk much to Maureen in between the time of Brendan, we learned about Brendan's death, and the reception that we had here in the Ample Room. And so during that reception, Maureen sought me out, and she's going to kill me for telling me this story. But she said, you know all those times when you came up to me and you said that Brendan Looney was special? And I said, yes, I do. She goes, well, you know what? You were right. Anyway, a few years ago when Coley Mellett died in a tragic plane crash, and I don't mean to go downer here on this, but I'm going to make a point here. Coley Mellett, 1992, he was a great musician, and he wound up being a guitarist for the Chuck Mangione Band. He died tragically in a plane crash a few years ago. His parents began working with other families to see to it that the airline industry adopt a new set of safety regulations. So New Year's Eve this past year, I'm watching the news, and the news was that we have just completed one of the safest years in aviation history, all because the FAA adopted those regulations the Melletts fought for. I take pride in that, and somehow feel that in our own way, we are all a part of it. I got an email yesterday from Mark First, class of 1974, standing outside of the orphanage he just had built in Zambia on the $80,000 he raised to get the job done. We have another alum named Kim Duncan, who is running a foundation he hopes will develop a vaccine to eradicate the AIDS virus and breast cancer. The point here is, I've not written about death or tragedy, but rather the triumph of the human spirit in the face of the most difficult of circumstances. And we at DeMatha are all a part of that experience. We are all part of this wonderful mosaic, this wonderful faith community whose reach, and I kid you not with no exaggeration, the reach extends to the far corners of the planet. So do root for Mike Bray in Notre Dame. You are a part of it. Root for James Brown when he hosts the Super Bowl, the third most watched show in television history. You are a part of it. The 8 alums in the seminary, the 6 alums who are now Navy SEALs, they were nurtured here because of teachers in this room and because of your support. We are one DeMatha. I have just one last story to tell, and that goes back to 1974, probably right back there on that pillar. I forgot that recess was not allowed in high school. And I was laying on the floor after tackling John Flaherty, and I looked up, and there's Buck Offit. And trust me, in 1974, that is not the guy you wanted to see at that time. And Buck, I think, had me right that night 500 times, I must not disrupt the cafeteria. But I bring that story up because I want to say, like 4 or 5 years ago, Buck was having some health issues, and he was struggling a little bit in the classroom. We still tried to find Buck a role, okay? But knowing Buck and the lion that he wasn't quite happy in that role, but he would alternate day by day. Some days he'd be happy, and some days he'd not be so happy about it. Well, he showed up one day, and he was not so happy. And he walked in the door, and I said to him, Buck, what do you want? And I said it like that. I can't believe I said that, but that is what I said. And Buck turned his head, and I said, yes, what do you want? I said, yesterday we spoke on the phone, and you said you were perfectly happy with the situation that we developed, and now you're here today, and you don't seem very happy. He said, I just want to be able to come back to DeMatha and just be a part of things. And Dan, at that point, happened to be there and said, Buck, no problem whatsoever. And Buck left. Well, anyway, about a week or so later, I was up in my office in the monastery, and Buck shows up. He sits down in the chair, and he goes, you know, last week when you were in here, and you asked me what I wanted. He goes, you knew what I wanted, didn't you? And I said, yeah, I know exactly what you wanted. You wanted to come to school and teach 5 classes a day like you always did. He said, that's exactly right. I said, Buck, you know, that is not going to happen anymore. He goes, well, you know, I could sue the school. I said, but why would you want to sue the school, Buck? I mean, you built a wonderful institution, and you're just going to have to take pride in that and sit back and enjoy the fact that you played such an integral role in building such a great place. And he said, I suppose you're right. And I said, well, you know what scares me, Buck? And he said, what's that? And I said, that 30 years from now, I'm going to be sitting in that chair where you are, and somebody's going to be sitting in this chair where I am, and we're going to be having the same conversation. And I said, I hope to leave before that happens. And he looked at me and he said, well, I hope you don't leave. And he got up and left. And 3 days later, he had a stroke, and I never ever spoke to him again. So, for Buck, I don't know how long it'll be. I mean, my wife probably thinks that I will be here for 60 more years. Who knows? I'll take it day by day. But in the words of a dime store poet, and I'll leave you at this, DeMatha today, DeMatha forever. Thank you.